March 14th, 1971. I remember that date because it was my birthday. I turned 37 that morning. But this isn't my story. This is about Catherine Reeves, a bush pilot from Anchorage, and what happened to her at 12,000 feet over the Wrangell Mountains. She recorded this account 3 days after the incident, and her voice on that tape still haunts me. The propeller hummed steady as Catherine checked her instruments one last time before departure. The Cessna 185 was reliable, well-maintained, and she'd flown this route to the remote mission at Copper Valley dozens of times. Easy money. 3 hours there, overnight at the mission, 3 hours back. She could do it in her sleep. Her passenger that morning was a nun, Sister Margaret, mid-60s, thin as wire, with hands that shook when she signed the manifest. She wore a heavy wool coat over her habit and carried only 2 items, a small canvas bag and a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in what looked like very old leather straps that had darkened with age and handling. Catherine asked if the box should go in the cargo hold, standard procedure for larger items. Sister Margaret's answer was immediate and firm. "It stays with me." Catherine had learned not to argue with passengers about their belongings. If someone wanted to hold a box for 3 hours, that was their business. She'd once flown a geologist who insisted on keeping a rock sample in his lap the entire flight. People had their reasons. They took off at 10:15 a.m. under perfect skies. Not a cloud anywhere. Visibility unlimited. Alaska spread out below them like a wrinkled map. White peaks, dark valleys, rivers like veins of silver threading through the wilderness. Catherine had always loved this moment, when the wheels left the ground and the world became something you could see all at once, something comprehensible from above, even when it made no sense on the ground. Sister Margaret sat rigid in the passenger seat, both hands gripping that box like she expected it to float away if she loosened her hold even slightly. Her knuckles were white, her breathing shallow and quick. Catherine tried to make small talk as they climbed to cruising altitude, asked about the mission, about how long Sister Margaret had been in Alaska, about whether she'd flown this route before. The nun gave short answers, distracted, her eyes fixed on something Catherine couldn't see. Maybe the horizon, maybe nothing at all. The cockpit smelled like aviation fuel and old coffee. Catherine had spilled her morning cup during pre-flight and hadn't bothered to clean it up properly. Small things like that mattered less when you spent half your life in the air. The stain would blend with a dozen others, each one a memory of a flight, a passenger, a moment suspended between departure and arrival. 30 minutes into the flight, somewhere over the eastern edge of the Wrangell Range, Sister Margaret finally spoke in a way that demanded attention. "Do you believe in consequences, Miss Reeves?" Catherine glanced over. The nun was still staring straight ahead, still gripping that box. Consequences? Actions that echo forward. Things we can't take back, no matter how much we wish we could. Choices that follow us for decades, getting heavier with every year that passes. Catherine gave some non-committal answer about how everyone makes mistakes, how life goes on, how you do your best and hope it's enough. She'd learned not to engage too deeply with passengers who got philosophical at altitude. Something about being suspended between earth and sky made people contemplative, made them want to discuss big questions with a stranger they'd never see again. Once, she'd spent 3 hours listening to a mining engineer explain his theory about how gold deposits proved the existence of divine providence. She'd lost feeling in her left leg from sitting still so long, nodding politely while he worked through increasingly elaborate theological arguments. But Sister Margaret wasn't finished. Her voice took on a confession booth quality, quiet and urgent at the same time. "I've spent 40 years trying to outrun a single moment, a single choice I made when I was young, and thought I had time to fix things later. But later never came. Or it came, and I wasn't ready. And now it's been so long that everyone involved is gone, and I'm left carrying this weight that no one else even knows exists." Catherine didn't know what to say to that. She focused on flying instead, checking the gauges, scanning for other aircraft, making minor adjustments to trim and heading. The mountains scrolled past below, beautiful and indifferent. Before she could formulate a response, the engine coughed. Just once. A brief hiccup in the steady drone that had been the soundtrack to the flight so far. Catherine's hands moved to the controls instinctively, muscle memory from thousands of hours in the cockpit. Her eyes swept the instrument panel. Oil pressure normal. Fuel flow normal. RPM steady. Cylinder head temperature within limits. Manifold pressure holding. Everything looked fine. The engine coughed again. Sister Margaret's voice went tight with sudden fear. "Is that normal?" "Sometimes happens at altitude," Catherine said, though her own pulse had kicked up a notch. "Change in air density. Fuel mixture needs adjustment. Nothing to worry about." But she was worried. The Cessna's Lycoming IO 520 was reliable as sunrise. She'd had it serviced just 2 weeks ago by Tommy Morrison, the best mechanic in Anchorage. Tommy had gone through everything: spark plugs, fuel lines, carburetor, magnetos. He'd pronounced the engine healthier than his own heart, and Tommy took his work seriously enough that Catherine trusted him completely. She enriched the mixture, checked the fuel selector valve, confirmed she was drawing from the fullest tank, scanned the wings for ice formation, even though the air was too dry for that and the temperature wasn't low enough. Checked the oil temperature, the fuel pressure, the tachometer. Everything normal, everything perfect. The engine sputtered, caught, sputtered again, and died. Complete silence except for the wind rushing past the fuselage and the whistle of air through the door seals. The sudden absence of engine noise was so profound, it felt physical, like something had been removed from the world, rather than simply stopped working. Catherine's training took over, automatic as breathing, trim for best glide speed, 73 knots for the Cessna 185. Pick a landing spot, scan the terrain, find something flat, find it fast, run through the restart procedure, fuel boost, pump on, mixture rich, throttle open slightly, magnetos check, starter engage. Nothing. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream, turning without power, a ghost of what it should be doing. The starter motor whined, but the engine refused to catch. No spark, no combustion, no life. They were over the worst possible terrain. The Wrangell Mountains stretched in every direction, peak after peak of hostile rock and ice. The valleys were too narrow, barely wide enough for the plane's wingspan. The slopes too steep, covered in snow that hid crevasses and boulders, and 100 other things that would tear the Cessna apart on impact. Catherine tried the starter again, pumping the throttle, adjusting the mixture. The engine turned over, but wouldn't catch. She could hear the starter motor, could feel the vibration through the airframe, but no ignition, no power. They were at 10,000 feet and dropping. Glide ratio for the Cessna was about 9-1. For every 1,000 feet of altitude, they could travel roughly 1.5 miles horizontally, which meant she had maybe 15 miles to find a place to put down. 15 miles of mountains that had killed better pilots than her. Sister Margaret whispered something Catherine couldn't quite hear over the wind noise. "What?" Catherine was scanning the terrain ahead desperately, looking for any possibility of survival. A frozen lake, maybe. A valley floor wide enough and flat enough. Anything. "I said it's my fault." The nun's voice was barely audible. "It's because of what's in the box." Catherine didn't have time for cryptic statements. She'd found a valley ahead that might work. Emphasis on might. It ran roughly east-west, maybe 1/4 mile wide at its broadest point. Floor covered in what looked like relatively smooth snow. But she couldn't tell how deep that snow was, couldn't see what lay underneath it. For all she knew, it covered a field of boulders that would flip them end over end. She tried the starter a 3rd time, 4th time. The battery was getting weaker with each attempt, the starter motor spinning slower, and soon she'd drain it completely and lose even the possibility of a restart. "Listen to me," Sister Margaret said, louder now, urgent. "You need to understand what I'm carrying. I need to land this plane." "You won't. Not unless you let me do what I should have done 40 years ago. Catherine shot her a look. The nun had opened the box. Inside was... Catherine struggled to process it, while simultaneously calculating approach angles and trying to judge the wind direction from the snow patterns below. It looked like a bundle of letters, old and yellowed, tied with string that had gone brown with age. But there was something else. A photograph, she thought, though she only glimpsed it for a second. And what might have been a ring. In 1931, Sister Margaret said, her voice taking on that confession booth quality again, I was not yet a nun. I was a nurse at a sanatorium in Colorado, a place called Mountain View, though that was a cruel name for it. Most of our patients never got well enough to see any mountains. They just stared at white walls until they stopped staring at all. 8,000 feet. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a cathedral built by a mad god. Catherine could see individual trees now, could make out the striations in the rock faces, could count the ridges between them and the valley floor. There was a patient there, a young man only 23 years old. His name was James Whitmore. Tuberculosis had eaten away at his lungs until he could barely speak above a whisper. But he was kind. He was so kind, Miss Reeves. He never complained, never asked why him, never raged against the unfairness of dying young. He just accepted it with a grace I've never seen before or since. Catherine wasn't really listening. She was too focused on the approach, on the impossible geometry of getting a fixed-wing aircraft safely onto a narrow valley floor, surrounded by peaks that rose thousands of feet on either side. She'd have to thread the needle, come in low and slow, drop into the valley from the eastern end where it widened slightly. But her hands were steady now. That was the strange thing about emergency situations. Once you committed to a course of action, once the decision was made, fear transformed into focus. This was what she'd been trained for. This was what hundreds of hours in the cockpit had prepared her for. He gave me these letters to mail to his family, Sister Margaret continued, compelled to finish her story, even as they fell toward the mountains. 15 letters, one for each person he loved, his parents, his siblings, his fiancée, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, his best friend from school, his former pastor. He'd spent weeks writing them, propping himself up in bed, even though it caused him terrible pain, pouring out everything he needed to say before the end. 6,000 feet. Catherine could see the valley clearly now, could see that yes, it was their only option, and yes, it was going to be close. Too close. The snow looked smooth enough, but there was a line of trees on the southern edge that she'd have to clear, and the western end of the valley narrowed into a box canyon that meant she'd have exactly one chance at this. No room for a go-around. No second attempt. I promised him I'd mail them. I held his hand. It was so cold, Miss Reeves, like holding a bird's wing, and I promised him they'd go out that very afternoon. He smiled. He actually smiled. And he said thank you. And that was enough. That promise was enough to let him go peacefully. He died that night, in his sleep, and I'd like to think he went easy, because he believed his words would reach the people he loved. Catherine pulled on the flaps, felt the aircraft slow and drop. She was committed now. The valley was rushing up to meet them, faster than she wanted, the mountains on either side blurring past. I never mailed them. Sister Margaret's voice cracked completely. I kept them. I told myself I'd send them later, after his death, when his family had time to grieve first. I didn't want to burden them with letters while they were still reeling from the loss. That's what I told myself. But it was a lie. The truth was, I couldn't bear to let them go. They were beautiful, Miss Reeves. The letters were so beautiful. 4,000 feet. Catherine could see animal tracks in the snow now. Could see the shadows cast by the trees, long and sharp in the morning light. Could see the texture of the mountainsides, every crevasse and outcropping standing in sharp relief. James had a gift with words, a poet's soul. Reading them felt like glimpsing something sacred, and I told myself I'd mail them tomorrow. Then tomorrow came, and I said next week. Then next week became next month, and before I knew it, 6 months had passed, and I heard that James's mother had died. Grief, they said. Her heart just gave out from the weight of losing her son. 2,000 feet. The trees were individual now, each one distinct. Catherine could see their branches, heavy with snow, could see the rocky outcroppings poking through the snow cover. She never got to read her son's final letter, the one where he told her that loving her had been the greatest gift of his life, that if he could choose his mother again, he'd choose her every time, that she shouldn't feel guilty about anything because he'd lived more fully in 23 years than most people do in 80. And it was my fault. I kept that from her. I kept all of them from reaching the people they were meant for. 1,500 feet. Catherine's hands moved with precision on the controls. Throttle, dead. Mixture, dead. Flaps, full down. Airspeed, 70 knots. Just a little too fast. She needed to bleed off speed without stalling. His fiancé died 2 years after that. Drove her car off a bridge. The newspaper called it an accident. But her sister told me the truth. She couldn't live with the silence. She thought James had stopped loving her before the end, that he'd been too angry or too bitter to say goodbye. But his letter to her was 12 pages long, 12 pages about how meeting her had made everything worthwhile. 1,000 feet. Catherine could see the imperfections in the snow now, could see where the wind had carved patterns, where something, maybe a moose, had broken through the crust. I kept the letters for 40 years, carried them from place to place, as I moved between hospitals, between assignments, until eventually I took my vows and joined the mission service. I thought maybe dedicating my life to helping others would lift the weight. But the guilt doesn't work like that. It just grows. It compounds. It becomes this thing you carry in your chest that gets heavier every single day. 500 feet. The valley floor was rushing up now, faster and faster. Catherine could see individual rocks in the snow, could see the texture of the tree bark. 3 days ago, I finally decided to take them to his family's hometown, to confess, to try to make it right, even though everyone who needed to read them is already dead. I thought maybe I could leave them at the family grave, or donate them to a historical society, or just release them somehow. Stop carrying them, stop letting them carry me. But what Catherine said next, her voice strangely calm considering they were about to crash, changed everything. What does any of this have to do with my engine? Sister Margaret looked at her with eyes that seemed much older than 60-something years. Eyes that had seen too much, held too much, broken under too much weight. Unsent words have weight, Miss Reeves. Real weight. The kind that pulls things down. Catherine wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her that was insane. That engines failed for mechanical reasons. Fuel contamination, or vapor lock, or magneto failure. Not because of guilt. Not because of undelivered letters written by a dead man in 1931. But they were at 300 feet now, and she'd run out of time for philosophy. The valley floor filled the windscreen. She could see every detail of the snow surface, could see exactly where they were going to hit. "Brace yourself," Catherine said. "This is going to be—" "No!" Sister Margaret was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "I'm going to fix this." "What are you— Sit down! We're about to crash." But the nun had already grabbed the door handle, yanked it open. The wind screamed into the cabin, with a sound like the world ending. So loud Catherine couldn't hear herself shouting for Sister Margaret to stop, to sit down, to close the door before the change in aerodynamics sent them into a spin. The cold hit like a physical blow, 50 below zero at altitude, maybe worse with the wind chill. Catherine's eyes watered instantly, tears freezing on her cheeks. Sister Margaret held the box out into the slipstream. The leather straps tore away immediately, whipped into nothing by the 100-mile-per-hour wind. The lid flipped open. "I'm sorry," the nun said, though Catherine wasn't sure if she was talking to her, to James Whitmore, to his family, to God, or to some combination of all of them. "I'm so sorry. I should have sent them 40 years ago. I should have kept my promise." Her voice broke completely. She let go. The box tumbled away, spinning in the turbulence, disintegrating as it went. the letters scattered like white birds against the gray mountains. 15 of them, Catherine counted later, though at the moment it felt like hundreds, like a blizzard of words released from decades of captivity. They spread across the sky in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. One moment together, bound by string and guilt and time, the next moment free, each following its own trajectory into the vast indifference of the Alaskan wilderness. Catherine watched them separate, drift, disappear. The photograph went too. She caught a glimpse of it, spinning, a young man's face smiling at a camera in some long-gone summer. The ring flashed once in the sunlight and was gone, and then the engine caught, not gradually, not with a sputter and cough and hesitant restart. It roared back to life, like it had never stopped, like the past 5 minutes of terrified gliding had been a dream, or a test, or a moment outside normal time. Catherine's hands moved on instinct, throttle forward, mixture rich. She felt the propeller bite the air, felt the aircraft surge forward with power, felt them rise instead of fall. They'd been at maybe 100 feet, maybe less, so close to the ground that Catherine could see individual needles on the pine branches, close enough that she'd been bracing for impact, body tensed against the inevitable crash. But now they were climbing. 200 feet, 500 feet, 1,000 feet. The valley floor fell away beneath them, beautiful and deadly, and no longer relevant. Sister Margaret pulled her door shut. The wind noise cut off abruptly, replaced by the steady drone of the engine, a sound so normal and reassuring that Catherine almost laughed with relief. Almost, because something was wrong with the quality of that engine sound. It wasn't wrong mechanically. The gauges showed everything normal, perfect even, but there was something underneath the drone, underneath the mechanical rhythm of pistons and valves and combustion. Voices. Catherine heard voices. Not loud, not clear enough to make out words, but unmistakably there. Multiple voices overlapping, rising and falling in what might have been conversation or might have been something else, something like singing maybe, or the way people sound when they're relieved, when they've been waiting for something for a very long time, and it's finally happened. She counted them. 15 distinct voices, she thought, though they wove together so seamlessly it was hard to be certain. Some high, some low, some young, some old, all of them expressing the same feeling, whatever that feeling was. Sister Margaret had buckled herself back in. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. In fact, she looked calmer than Catherine had ever seen anyone look, like she'd just set down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. They didn't speak for the rest of the flight to Copper Valley. What was there to say? How do you discuss something like that? How do you put into words what they'd both just witnessed? The mission appeared ahead. Catherine lined up for final approach, went through the landing checklist with methodical precision. The wheels touched snow-covered ground with barely a bump. Perfect landing. Maybe the best of her career. She taxied to the parking area and shut down the engine. The silence after it stopped felt larger than normal. Sister Margaret gathered her canvas bag, opened the door, put one foot on the snowy ground, then paused. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? I almost killed us both." "No." Sister Margaret turned to look at her, and Catherine saw tears on the nun's face. Not sad tears, something else. "You helped me finish what I should have done 40 years ago. You helped me let them go." She climbed out and walked toward the mission buildings without looking back. Catherine sat in the cockpit for 2 hours after that, just sat there, hands on the yoke, staring at the instrument panel. Eventually, the mission staff invited her in for coffee and the traditional overnight stay. The next morning, she flew back to Anchorage alone. The engine performed perfectly. She had Tommy Morrison inspect it anyway. He spent 6 hours going through everything, found nothing wrong. "This engine is perfect," he said. "Better than perfect." Catherine didn't tell him what happened, didn't tell anyone for 3 years. But when she finally told me in 1974, sitting in a diner in downtown Anchorage, she said something I've never forgotten. "When the engine started again, just for a second I heard voices, 15 of them, all saying the same thing. I asked her what they said. She paused for a long time. Then, "Thank you," they said thank you. Catherine Reeves died in 1989. Before she passed, she left instructions in her will. She wanted her ashes scattered over that valley in the Wrangles. Her daughter Sarah carried out the request and called me afterward. She'd seen the white patterns in the snow, still there, still moving. But there was something new. The patterns had formed into something that looked almost like words. Welcome home. I tried to find Sister Margaret. She'd died in 1979 at a convent in Seattle. Heart attack. The Mother Superior said she'd seemed at peace in her final years. They'd found something clutched in her hand when she died. A letter, addressed to Margaret Walsh, her birth name, written in handwriting that matched James Whitmore's letters. It said only, "I forgive you. Rest now." That's what I believe now, after all these years. Words have power. Real, physical power. The things we say, the things we don't say, they all matter. They all have weight. And sometimes, when that weight becomes too much, the universe gives us a chance to make it right. I still fly over the Wrangles occasionally, just to look. And those patterns are always there. 15 white shapes, moving slowly through the snow, like words searching for their destination. Catherine understood that some journeys don't end when we want them to, that some words need to be said, even if decades late, that it's never too late to finish what we started. That's the mercy flight. And if you ever find yourself in a small plane, and your engine coughs for no reason, and someone next to you is holding something they need to let go, maybe listen to them. Maybe help them release it, because unsent words have weight, and sometimes setting them free is the only way to fly.